Imdi sing. That was the last thing I heard before my own son raised his hand and slapped me. Not once, not twice, but 20 slaps. 20 slaps. 20 times my heart broke into pieces, mixing with the cold, indifferent laughter of my daughter-in-law right beside me. That night, amidst the pain and humiliation, I had an epiphany. Silence was no longer love. It was suicide. I understood that the time had come to stand up for myself. The next morning, after they left for work, I secretly sold the house. And when he returned, inserting his key into the lock was new. Before I continue, I would love to know where you are watching this video from. Every one of your comments is a heartbeat that connects hearts that feel the same way. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because here every story is a reminder. It is never too late to say this life is mine. My name is Olivia. I am 60 years old, and my whole life I always believed that family was everything, the only place where you could find unconditional love. I cherished that belief like a prized possession, guarding it and protecting it. Even when the cracks began to appear in the wall of happiness I worked so hard to build. Even then, I convinced myself that family meant sacrifice, that love meant putting others first always, that a mother's duty was to endure. My husband James had been gone for 12 years. Lung cancer took him too quickly for proper goodbyes. He left me our apartment in the suburbs, the one we'd saved for during the first 15 years of our marriage. The walls held our history, the pencil marks tracking Robert's height as he grew the small dent in the living room wall from when James tried to move the bookshelf himself, the kitchen where I taught Robert to make his grandmother's lasagna. I'd lived there for 30 years, surrounded by memories both beautiful and painful. I can still remember Robert as a child, his small hand in mine as we walked to the elementary school 3 blocks away, his bright eyes when he got his first bicycle, the pride in his voice when he called from college to tell me he'd made the dean's list, the love I felt watching him graduate James's empty seat beside me, aching with absence. I had poured everything into my son, every hope, every dream, every ounce of love I had. But somewhere along the way something changed. Perhaps it was when he met Carol with her sharp edges and sharper tongue. Perhaps it was the pressure of his corporate job, the constant stress that seemed to hollow him out. Perhaps it was simply that he grew into someone different than I had imagined, someone who saw my love as weakness, my presence as burden. It started with small things, the way he'd sigh when I called, the impatient tone when I asked about his day, the hurried visits that felt more obligation than choice. Then came Carol with her designer clothes and practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. From the beginning, she made it clear that I was an afterthought in their lives, a complication to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. When Robert suggested I sell my apartment and move in with them, I was surprised but hopeful. The house was beautiful. 2 stories with a white picket fence and a rose garden I tended every morning. He said it would be easier for everyone, that I wouldn't have to manage alone, that we could be a family again. He was so convincing, his eyes sincere as he placed his hand over mine. What he didn't say, what I later discovered in a folder of legal documents, was that the house would be purchased with the money from selling my apartment, but would be in his name. For taxes, he explained. For simplicity. And because I trusted my son, because I believed in family above all, I signed the transfer papers. I kept the original deeds in my name tucked away in an old keepsake box with James's wedding ring and the letters he wrote me when we were young. The first few months were pleasant enough. I had my own room, a small sitting area, access to the garden. I cooked family dinners 3 times a week, delighting in having someone to care for again. But slowly, subtly, the atmosphere changed. Robert began working later. Carol's courtesy thinned to bare tolerance. My suggestions about the house were met with tight smiles and later dismissal. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, present but unseen, heard, but not listened to. Carol always brought wine when we had dinner, despite knowing I couldn't drink because of my blood pressure medication. A small cruelty, but one of many. The strong scent of her perfume that gave me headaches, the way she'd speak about me in third person when I was sitting right there. The subtle criticisms about my clothes, my cooking, my existence. I'd force myself to suppress any reaction, maintaining a conciliatory attitude, trying to keep peace in a house that increasingly felt like a battlefield with me as the only casualty. I knew deep in my heart that Carol didn't like me. She saw me as a burden, an obstacle in her life with Robert. But I kept trying every day to make the atmosphere less tense, even if only a little. I'd retreat to my room earlier each evening, make myself scarcer each weekend. I learned to move quietly through the house, to need less, to ask for nothing. I became smaller to avoid being a target. That particular Sunday had begun like so many others. I woke early, the pale morning light filtering through my curtains. I spent extra time in the garden, finding peace among my roses, their perfume a gentle reminder of simpler days. By mid-morning, I was in the kitchen preparing Robert's favorite dish, baked ziti with extra creamy sauce. It was the meal he'd requested every birthday since he was 8 years old, a tradition that connected us through the years. I selected each ingredient with care. The freshest ricotta, the herbs from my small garden patch. The sauce simmered slowly, just as my mother had taught me. Into each step I poured my love, a language I'd spoken his entire life. Carol arrived first, punctual as always. The strong scent of her perfume invaded the kitchen, a smell that always gave me a headache. But I suppressed my discomfort as I'd learned to do. She gave me that pale smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and placed a bottle of cheap wine on the table. "For my dear mother-in-law," she said with a somewhat ironic tone. I thanked her as always, a formal acknowledgement to maintain harmony, to avoid unnecessary trouble. She sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone while I finished the final preparations. Not once did she offer to help. Not once did she ask about my day or comment on the effort I'd made. The silence between us hung heavy, filled with unspoken resentments. Robert arrived half an hour later. I knew immediately something was wrong by the way he harshly tossed his keys onto the table. The metallic sound startled me, a discordant note in the quiet kitchen. His greeting was abrupt, a simple mom, with no warmth, no eye contact. I didn't ask what was wrong. Experience had taught me that Robert's outbursts of anger were best weathered in silence. Those rages seemed to appear from nowhere, harsh words thrown at me, as if I were responsible for every frustration in his life. We sat down at the table and I served the food in silence. The delicious smell of the baked ziti filled the room, but my appetite had vanished. I just wanted the meal to end quickly so I could retreat to my room and escape the tension that surrounded us like storm clouds. Carol picked at her food, making a show of taking the smallest portions. Robert ate mechanically, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. I tried to make conversation. Small, harmless topics about the garden, a book I'd been reading, the changing season. Each attempt met with monosyllabic responses or silence. Finally, I stopped trying. It was then that unintentionally I mentioned the kitchen faucet was dripping and needed repair. It was just a casual observation, a small reminder without any intention of reproach or demand. But Robert seized it like a weapon. "The faucet in your house, is that what you mean, Mother?" The words sliced through the air, each one emphasized, to remind me that I was there by his grace, not by right. "It's just a faucet, my son," I replied softly, trying to keep my voice calm, my eyes lowered to my barely touched plate. Robert slammed his hand on the table, causing the silverware to jump with a jarring noise that sent my heart racing. "Do you think you're very smart, Mother? Do you think you can tell me what to do in my own house?" His voice was thick with anger, his face flushed crimson-blue veins prominent on his forehead. Beside him, Carol laughed softly behind her napkin, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She enjoyed seeing me humiliated, watching me suffer under Robert's wrath. It fed something dark in her that I'd never understood. "Shut up, you parasite." The words exploded from him, making me flinch. "Do you forget that I took you in when nobody else wanted you? You forget that you could be in a nursing home right now." I remained silent, my eyes fixed on my plate of food. The baked ziti I had prepared with so much love now seemed like a tasteless mess, as heavy as the air around us. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, but I kept them hidden beneath the table. "Look at me when I speak to you, Mother." Robert's voice dropped dangerously low as he reached across the table and grabbed my chin, forcing my face up. His fingers dug into my skin hard enough to leave marks. I looked at him, my eyes filled with a lifetime of love now clouded by pain and helplessness. It was then that it happened. The first slap landed like an electric shock, not from the physical pain, which was substantial, but from the surprise of it. Never in my entire life had my son hit me. The sound echoed in the silent dining room, and I felt my cheek sting as tears welled up unbidden. "Robert, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. The second slap was harder, then the third, the fourth. I lost count after the 10th. My ears rang. My entire face burned. I didn't scream. I didn't plead further. I didn't resist. I remained sitting motionless, letting my own son vent his rage on me as if I were nothing more than a punching bag for his frustrations. Carol gasped dramatically at first, covering her mouth with her hand, but her eyes betrayed her. They were smiling, enjoying the spectacle, reveling in my suffering. 20 slaps. 20 times his hand connected with my face, my head snapping to the side with each impact. 20 moments where something broke inside me, something fundamental that could never be repaired. When he finally stopped his breathing heavy and labored, I simply stood up, my movements mechanical, and began clearing the table. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them helped. I worked in silence, my body operating on autopilot while my mind retreated somewhere far away, somewhere safe from the pain and humiliation. After I'd cleaned his kitchen, wiping away all evidence of the meal I'd lovingly prepared, I went to my room without a word. I closed the door quietly behind me, careful not to make any sound that might reignite Robert's anger. Only then, in the privacy of my small sanctuary, did I allow myself to really feel what had happened. I stood before the mirror, examining my reflection in the dim light. My cheeks were red and beginning to swell. Tomorrow there would be bruises, evidence of a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Tears slid silently down my face as I gently touched the tender skin, wincing at the contact. This wasn't the first time I'd been disrespected in this house. There had been countless small humiliations, daily indignities that eroded my sense of worth bit by bit. But this physical violation, was different. This was a declaration that I was less than human in their eyes. This was the culmination of a path we'd been walking for years, a destination I'd refused to see even as we approached it step by step. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands folded in my lap, and thought about the path that had led me here. I thought about James, and wondered what he would say if he could see his son now, the boy we'd raised with such love turned into a man capable of such cruelty. I thought about my own mother, who had taught me that family was everything, that sacrifice was love. Had she been wrong? Or had I simply loved unwisely, giving everything and expecting nothing until nothing was exactly what I received? The house was quiet now. Robert and Carol had retreated to their bedroom upstairs. I could hear the faint sound of the television, the occasional muffled laugh. Life continuing as if nothing monumental had occurred, as if they hadn't just shattered something irreparable. I moved to the small desk in the corner of my room and opened the bottom drawer. Beneath a stack of old letters and photographs was the keepsake box where I'd stored the things too precious or painful to display. Inside was James's wedding ring, smooth and golden after all these years. The love letters he'd written me during our courtship paper, yellowed with age, but words still vibrant with devotion. And beneath them, folded carefully, were the original deeds to the house, still bearing my name. I held the papers in my trembling hands, reading words I'd signed but never fully understood. Property rights, transfer of ownership, conditional occupancy, legal terms that suddenly seemed vitally important in a way they hadn't before. Robert had told me the house would be in his name for tax purposes for simplicity's sake. But he'd never mentioned that my name remained on certain documents, that legally I still had rights he'd persuaded me to ignore. That night, lying awake in my bed listening to the occasional creak of the house settling around me, I had a moment of absolute clarity. The epiphany came not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow dawning of truth, like the gradual lightening of the sky before sunrise. Silence was not love. Sacrifice without respect was not nobility, but self-destruction. I had spent my life believing that family meant enduring anything, accepting everything, that a mother's love was measured by her willingness to disappear for the sake of her children. But in that moment, I understood that I had been wrong. There is a difference between selfless love and self-erasure, a difference between supporting someone's growth and enabling their cruelty, a difference between sacrifice and surrender. And in that moment, with my face still stinging from my son's rage, I finally understood that difference. It was 3 a.m. when I made the first call. My hands shook as I dialed, afraid that the sound would carry through the quiet house. Charlie had been James's lawyer and friend for 30 years. He'd helped with the will after James died, had given advice about the apartment sale. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I remembered his home number. James had insisted I memorize it, just in case. The phone rang 4 times before Charlie answered, his voice thick with sleep, but alert with concern at the unusual hour. "Olivia, is everything all right?" I spoke softly, each word measured and calm, despite the storm inside me. "Charlie, I need to sell a house, and I need to do it tomorrow." There was a pause. The sound of movement as Charlie presumably sat up in bed switched on a light. "Tell me what's happened." I did. In quiet, steady sentences, I told him everything. The arrangement with Robert, the escalating tension, the final explosion of violence. I told him about the original deeds I still possessed. I told him what I wanted to do. When I finished, Charlie was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'll be at my office at 7. Come straight there. Bring the deeds and any other paperwork you have. And Olivia, take photos of your face. Document what he did to you. It might be important." I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, of clarity. The path ahead was uncertain and frightening, but for the first time in a long time, it was my path chosen by me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I began preparing with methodical care. I gathered the few possessions that truly mattered: James's ring and letters, the photo albums I'd painstakingly maintained, the pearl earrings my mother had given me on my wedding day. Everything else, the furniture, the clothes, the accumulated objects of a lifetime, suddenly seemed insubstantial weights I was ready to shed. At 5 in the morning, I took photographs of my face in the bathroom mirror, clinical and detached, as if documenting someone else's injuries. The bruises were forming now purplish blue against my pale skin. Evidence, proof, a record of the moment everything changed. At 6, I heard Robert's alarm, the familiar sounds of morning rituals beginning above me. I stayed in my room, door closed, heart pounding with the fear of discovery. But my resolve remained unshaken. I listened as they moved about the house, as coffee brewed and shower water ran. At 7:30, I heard Robert call out a perfunctory goodbye, not expecting or receiving a response. The front door closed. Carol's lighter step followed 20 minutes later. Then silence. Blessed empty silence. Only then did I emerge, moving through the house that had been my prison, with new eyes. I called a taxi, an extravagance I'd denied myself for years, and left without looking back, the precious deeds secure in my handbag. Charlie was waiting his office, already bustling despite the early hour. He'd aged since I'd last seen him, hair now completely silver, face more lined, but his eyes were the same, sharp kind, determined. He ushered me into his private office, his expression darkening as he saw my face in the full light. "Jesus, Olivia," he muttered, gesturing for me to sit. "He did this to you." I nodded, placing the documents on his desk with steady hands. "I want to sell the house. Today, if possible. And I don't want Robert to know until it's done." Charlie examined the paperwork carefully, making occasional notes, his frown deepening. "There's something not right about these transfer documents," he said finally. "The way they're structured. It's as if Robert was advised by someone who knew exactly how to create the appearance of full ownership while legally leaving certain rights with you. Did he have financial problems at the time, tax issues?" I shook my head, but uncertainty crept in. Robert had been insistent about putting the house in his name, had arranged everything with a lawyer I'd never met, had hurried me through the signing with reassurances that it was all standard procedure. "I don't know," I admitted. "He said it was for tax purposes, to make things simpler. I trusted him." Charlie's expression softened with compassion. "You had every reason to trust your son, Olivia. This isn't your fault." He tapped the original deeds. "The good news is that these give us leverage. You still have legal rights to the property. We can force a sale, especially given the circumstances." "How quickly can we do this?" I asked. Charlie thought for a moment. "I have a client, Richard Harmon, who buys properties for investment. He has cash on hand and can move fast. The market value of the house is probably around $750,000, but if you're willing to accept less for a quick no-questions sale." "I just need enough to start over," I said. "Somewhere Robert can't find me easily." Charlie nodded, already reaching for his phone. "Let me make some calls. Wait here." What followed was a blur of activity. Calls, more paperwork, signatures, legal terms I barely understood but trusted Charlie to explain. Richard Harmon arrived at 11, a brisk businessman in his 50s who assessed the situation quickly and made an offer without haggling, $650,000 cash, closing immediately, no contingencies. Less than market value, but enough. More than enough. "There's one more thing," Charlie said as we finalized the details. "You'll need to change the locks immediately. Today, before Robert returns home. I have a client who's a locksmith. He's discreet and can be there within the hour." I hesitated, the reality of what I was doing suddenly overwhelming. This wasn't just about selling a house. This was about cutting ties with my son, making a statement that couldn't be misinterpreted or ignored. This was about drawing a line that said no more. "Do it," I said finally. "Change the locks." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, it was done. The house was sold, the money transferred to a new account, in my name only at a different bank than the one Robert and I had shared. The locks were changed, the security codes reset. Richard Harmon had given me 30 days to remove any personal belongings, a courtesy he extended after Charlie explained the circumstances. 30 days during which Robert and Carol would have to find new accommodations. I returned to the house one last time, escorted by Charlie, who insisted on coming with me, just in case. The new keys felt strange in my hand, symbolic of the power shift that had occurred in a single day. We entered quietly, the house feeling different somehow. No longer mine, but not yet someone else's. I packed quickly, efficiently, taking only what mattered. Clothes, personal documents, a few mementos. Most of it fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. Charlie watched from the doorway, concerned but respectful of my process. "Where will you go?" he asked as I closed the second suitcase. I had thought about this carefully. "There's a small hotel downtown where James and I stayed once when our heating went out in winter. It's modest but clean. I'll go there while I figure out next steps." Charlie nodded, then hesitated. "Olivia, when Robert comes home and finds the locks changed." "I know," I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "He'll be angry, furious, but I won't be here to bear the brunt of it. Not anymore. He might try to contest the sale, claim you were coerced or weren't of sound mind." I touched my bruised cheek gently. "Let him try. We have evidence of who was doing the coercing, and I've never been more sound of mind than I am right now." We loaded my belongings into Charlie's car, and as we drove away, I didn't look back at the house with its white picket fence and rose garden. That chapter was closed. The future was uncertain, terrifying in its openness, but it was mine to shape. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt the weight of expectations and obligations lift from my shoulders. I felt light. I felt possible. The hotel was exactly as I remembered, slightly worn but clean and comfortable. The desk clerk raised an eyebrow at my bruised face, but asked no questions as I paid for a week in advance cash. The room was small, impersonal, a temporary haven while I planned my next move. Sitting on the edge of the bed that first night, surrounded by my meager possessions, I should have felt bereft adrift. Instead, I felt a curious sense of peace. The decision had been made, the action taken. There was no going back, only forward into whatever came next. I thought about Robert, imagined him arriving home, key in hand, discovering it no longer worked. The confusion giving way to anger, the pounding on the door that no one would answer. The calls to my phone that I had already disconnected and replaced. I felt a pang of sadness for the little boy he had once been, for the relationship we had lost long before today's final severing. But I felt no regret for my actions. Some bridges once burned should remain ashes. The next morning I woke early, habit ingrained after decades of rising with the sun. For a moment, disorientation clouded my mind. The unfamiliar ceiling, the sound of traffic outside, the absence of kitchen duties calling me downward. Then memory returned, along with the dull ache in my face, and I remembered I was free, untethered, responsible only to myself. I showered and dressed carefully, applying makeup to cover the worst of the bruising. Then I went down to the hotel lobby and asked to use their computer. The young woman at the desk directed me to a small business center off the main entrance, a windowless room with 2 desktop computers and a printer. It was empty, quiet, perfect for my needs. I began searching for apartments, for houses outside the city, for communities where a woman my age might start over without too many questions. I searched methodically, making notes, comparing options. I had money now, not a fortune, but enough to buy something modest outright, to live simply but comfortably for years if I was careful. The freedom to choose was dizzying after so long. It was on the 3rd day of searching that I found it. A small farmhouse 3 hours from the city, set on 2 acres with a stream running along the property line. The house itself was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom in need of some repairs, but structurally sound according to the listing. What caught my attention was the photograph of the apple and peach trees in the yard, gnarled and ancient, but still bearing fruit. The asking price was $250,000, well within my means. I called the realtor from my new phone, arranged to see the property the following day. The woman who answered sounded surprised at my interest. The house had been on the market for nearly a year with little attention, but agreed readily to meet me there at 11. The drive took me through unfamiliar countryside rolling hills, giving way to small farms and scattered houses. I followed the GPS directions, carefully turning onto increasingly narrow roads until I found myself on a gravel lane that wound through a stand of old oak trees. And then suddenly there it was, the farmhouse from the photographs, white clapboard with green shutters, a wide front porch sagging slightly at one corner, the ancient fruit trees standing sentinel in the side yard. The realtor was already there, a middle-aged woman named Patricia with a practical haircut and sensible shoes. She seemed surprised to see me arrive alone, but asked no personal questions as she led me through the house, pointing out features and flaws with equal honesty. "It needs work," she admitted as we stood in the kitchen with its outdated appliances and worn linoleum floor. "But the bones are good. The roof was replaced 5 years ago, the well is reliable, and the septic system passed inspection. The previous owner was an elderly gentleman who lived here alone for 30 years. He died last winter and his children are selling. They live out of state and just want it off their hands." I moved through the rooms, slowly absorbing the feel of the place. It was small but not cramped, with large windows that filled the spaces with light. The living room had a fireplace of river stone, the bedrooms simple but adequate. Everything was dated, worn, in need of updating, but I could see the potential beneath the wear. Outside, Patricia showed me the property boundaries, the stream that marked the eastern edge, the small barn that could serve as a workshop or storage. The fruit trees were indeed old but healthy branches, heavy with small green fruits that would ripen in late summer. "Why hasn't it sold?" I asked, finally, standing beneath an apple tree, feeling the rough bark against my palm. Patricia shrugged. "Location mostly. It's too far from the city for commuters, too small for most families, too much work for retirees looking for turnkey properties. And to be honest, it's a bit isolated. The nearest neighbor is half a mile that way." She gestured northward, and the village is 3 miles south. Not everyone wants that kind of solitude. But I did. After years of walking on eggshells, of shrinking myself to avoid conflict, the idea of space, physical and emotional, was intoxicating. A place where no one would hear me if I wanted to play music or sing or cry. A place where I could expand into myself without fear of taking up too much room in someone else's life. "I'll take it," I said. Patricia blinked in surprise. "Don't you want to think about it? Maybe get an inspection check for—" "I'll take it," I repeated more firmly. "As is. I can pay cash." 2 weeks later, the farmhouse was mine. The closing was simple, the paperwork minimal compared to the complicated transaction of selling Robert's house. I signed my name alone, and received the keys to my new beginning. I moved in with little fanfare. My 2 suitcases, the box of mementos, and a few basic necessities purchased on the drive up. The house echoed with emptiness at first, but I found I didn't mind. The space felt clean, uncluttered by memories or expectations. A blank canvas. Those first few days were the hardest. The silence pressed in around me, especially at night when the darkness seemed absolute compared to the city lights I'd known all my life. I would lie awake listening to unfamiliar creaks and rustles, questioning my impulsive decision. Had I been rash? Was I running away rather than standing firm? Should I have confronted Robert directly instead of this indirect final gesture? But with the dawn would come clarity again. I would watch the sunrise from my porch, coffee in hand, and remember the feeling of Robert's hand striking my face. Remember Carol's smirk behind her napkin. Remember the slow erosion of my personhood in that house with its white picket fence and rose garden. And I would know bone deep that I had made the only choice that allowed me to reclaim my dignity. I established routines quickly, breakfast on the porch if weather permitted, then tackling one small project each day. I cleaned decades of grime from windows, letting light flood rooms that had been dim for too long. I scrubbed floors, repaired cabinet hinges, weeded the overgrown garden patch. Physical labor that left my muscles aching, but my mind clear. It was during my second week at the farmhouse that I heard about the animal shelter in the village. I'd gone in for supplies, paint for the kitchen, some basic tools, and overheard 2 women discussing volunteer needs at the rescue, as they called it. I found myself following them out, asking hesitant questions about the facility, what kind of help they needed. The older woman, Ellen, studied me with kind but assessing eyes. "We always need help with the dogs especially. Walking, grooming, just giving them some attention. Most of our volunteers are teenagers who come after school, but they're unreliable in summer. You got experience with animals." We'd always had cats when Robert was growing up. Easier to care for with our busy schedules. But I'd grown up on the edges of farm country and wasn't intimidated by dogs. Some, I said. I'm willing to learn. Ellen nodded. Come by tomorrow morning if you want. We open at 9. The shelter was a modest operation, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the village run primarily by volunteers with one paid staff member who served as director. The noise hit me first when I entered, barking, whining, the occasional yowl from the cat section. The smell was next not unpleasant but strong, kibble-wet fur cleaning supplies. Ellen spotted me hovering near the entrance and waved me over. Didn't think you'd actually come, she said, but her tone was approving. Let me show you around. She led me through the facility, explaining procedures and needs. The dogs were housed in 2 long rows of kennels, each with an indoor sleeping area and outdoor run. Most were mixed breeds, various sizes and ages, all looking up hopefully as we passed. Most of these will find homes eventually, Ellen explained. But some have been here a long time. Too old, too much energy, too many issues. People want puppies, perfect dogs. These guys, she gestured to a section where the larger, older dogs were housed. They get overlooked. At the end of the row was a kennel somewhat separated from the others. Inside was a medium-sized dog with caramel-colored fur curled in the corner of its bed back to the world. Unlike the others, this one didn't approach the fence or show any interest in our presence. That's Popcorn, Ellen said, her voice softening. Been here 8 months. Found wandering on the highway, no collar, no chip. Some jerk probably dumped him when they realized he wasn't going to stay small and cute forever. He's not bad with people once he knows you, but he doesn't trust easily. Doesn't play well with other dogs either, which limits his adoption chances. Something about the dog's deliberate disengagement, its withdrawal from hope, struck a chord deep within me. I recognized that posture, that careful construction of indifference as protection against disappointment. I'd lived it myself. Can I sit with him for a while? I asked. Ellen raised an eyebrow but shrugged. Knock yourself out. Don't expect much, though. He's not big on new people. She opened the kennel door, and I entered slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. I sat on the concrete floor near the door, not approaching the dog, but simply existing in the same space. Popcorn remained in his corner, only the slight twitch of his ear indicating he was aware of my presence at all. I didn't speak or try to engage him. I simply sat breathing quietly, letting him decide if and when interaction would occur. After about 15 minutes, Ellen poked her head in. You okay in here? He giving you any trouble? I shook my head. We're just getting to know each other. She gave me an odd look, but withdrew without comment. I continued my quiet vigil for another half hour before standing carefully. See you tomorrow, Popcorn, I said softly, and left the kennel without trying to touch or approach him. I returned the next day and the next, establishing a routine of sitting with Popcorn for an hour each morning before helping with other shelter tasks, walking the more sociable dogs, cleaning kennels, folding laundry. On the 4th day, Popcorn shifted slightly during my visit, turning so that he could see me from his corner without moving his body fully. Progress of a sort. On the 7th day, he stood and stretched, then walked a careful circle around the perimeter of the kennel, maintaining maximum distance from where I sat. His eyes, amber and watchful, assessed me with wary intelligence. No pressure, I told him softly. Take your time. By the end of the 2nd week, Popcorn had progressed to sitting halfway between his corner and my position, still watchful, but less tense. By the 3rd week, he would approach within a few feet, sniff the air near my hand, then retreat to a safe distance. Never seen anything like it, Ellen commented one day watching through the kennel window. He's actually starting to come around. What's your secret? I thought about the question seriously before answering. I think I understand what it's like to be afraid of being hurt again, to build walls because the world hasn't been kind. We recognize that in each other. Ellen studied me with new interest, taking in the fading bruises on my face that makeup couldn't entirely conceal. But she asked no questions, simply nodded as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. You thinking of adopting him once he trusts you more? The question startled me. I hadn't considered it consciously, but the idea settled into my mind with surprising rightness. My farmhouse was quiet, sometimes too quiet, and Popcorn needed a home where his wariness would be understood, his boundaries respected. Maybe, I admitted, if he decides he wants to come with me. It took another 2 weeks of daily visits before Popcorn allowed me to touch him. A brief contact, my hand gently stroking his back, as he remained tensely alert, ready to retreat if necessary. But he didn't pull away, and the next day he approached me directly for the first time, sitting beside me for a full minute before moving to his usual middle-distance position. "That's practically a declaration of love from him," Ellen observed. "You've got the adoption paperwork ready if you want it." I completed the forms that afternoon, and the following day I brought a collar leash and dog bed to the shelter. Popcorn watched with interest as I placed the bed in the corner of his kennel. "What do you think?" I asked him. "Want to come home with me? It's quiet there. Plenty of space to run. No one will hurt you." As if understanding my words, he approached and sat directly in front of me, looking into my eyes with solemn consideration. Then deliberately, he placed his paw on my knee, the first time he'd initiated contact. Ellen laughed when I told her I was ready to take him home. "Match made in heaven," she declared. "Two cautious souls figuring out trust together." The drive back to the farmhouse was tense. Popcorn had never been in a car with me, and he panted anxiously in the back seat, eyes fixed on the passing landscape. But when we arrived and I opened the car door, he stepped out cautiously, sniffing the air, taking in the new surroundings. I didn't rush him. I simply opened the front door and waited as he explored the yard, marking territory, investigating the new smells. Finally, he approached the porch steps, looking at me as if for permission. "It's your home too now," I told him. "Come in when you're ready." He followed me inside, moving carefully through each room, cataloging exits and safe spaces. When he'd completed his inspection, he returned to where I sat on the couch and placed his head briefly on my knee before retreating to the dog bed I'd positioned in the corner of the living room. Not full trust, not yet, but a beginning. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I realized something profound had shifted in me over these weeks. In helping Popcorn begin to trust again, I had begun my own healing. The bruises on my face had faded, but more importantly, the deeper wounds, the ones to my sense of self, my belief in my own worth, were starting to close. 60 years old, starting over in a farmhouse that needed work with a dog that flinched at sudden movements. Not the life I had imagined. Not the golden years I had planned. But as I drifted towards sleep, Popcorn's steady breathing from his bed, a comforting presence in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope. Not for some perfect future, but for a life that was genuinely mine, shaped by my choices rather than my fears. The first month in my new home passed in a gentle rhythm of small improvements and quiet discoveries. Popcorn and I settled into routines that respected each other's boundaries while gradually building trust. Each morning, we'd walk the perimeter of the property, the dewy grass soaking my shoes, as he investigated the same landmarks with fresh curiosity. Sometimes freedom looks like wet feet at sunrise, and a caramel-colored dog running ahead on a path that belongs to no one else. I was relearning how to exist in a space that responded to my choices alone. No one sighed when I spent too long in the garden. No one rolled their eyes when I left a book open on the arm of the chair. No one's mood determined the atmosphere of the entire house. The silence that had initially seemed oppressive now felt like a canvas awaiting my particular colors. I played music, classical in the mornings, jazz in the evenings, letting it fill rooms that had been quiet too long. The house itself began responding to my attention. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow that caught the morning light, replaced the worn linoleum with simple ceramic tiles. I learned to fix leaky faucets, patch drywall, repair loose floorboards. YouTube became my instructor patience, my tool. My hands, which had spent decades serving others, now created spaces that served me. It was during my 6th week at the farmhouse that I met Helen properly. I'd seen her occasionally in the village. A tall woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut in a practical bob, always dressed in crisp cotton shirts and well-worn jeans. She lived half a mile up the road in a larger farmhouse with expansive gardens that locals spoke of with admiration. That Tuesday, she appeared at my door carrying a basket of tomatoes and zucchini, Popcorn's warning bark alerting me to her presence before she knocked. My surprise must have shown on my face as I opened the door. Visitors were rare, intentionally so. "Hope I'm not intruding." Helen's voice was warm but direct. "I've been meaning to welcome you properly. The garden's producing more than I can handle, thought you might make use of some." The simple neighborly gesture, no agenda, no expectation, nearly undid me. How long had it been since someone had offered something without wanting something in return? I accepted the basket, invited her in for coffee. We sat on the porch while Popcorn maintained a watchful distance, circling us with cautious interest. "Shelter dog," Helen nodded toward him. I explained our mutual wariness, our gradual building of trust. Helen listened without interruption, her eyes occasionally drifting to the fading yellowish marks on my face. The last visible evidence of Robert's rage now in the final stages of healing. She didn't ask directly about the bruises, but something in her expression told me she understood their origin. "Takes courage to start over," she said, finally setting down her empty mug. "Especially alone." The observation hung between us, not a question but an opening if I chose to take it. For a moment I considered my usual deflection, the practiced smile and change of subject that had become second nature. But here in this new place, with this straightforward woman who had shared her garden's bounty, the old patterns seemed unnecessary. "My son hit me," the words emerged with unexpected steadiness. 20 times in front of his wife, who laughed. "I sold the house from under them the next day and came here." Helen didn't flinch or offer platitudes. She simply nodded her eyes, holding mine with quiet respect. "Good for you." Those 3 words, the simplicity of their approval, the absence of questions or judgment, cracked something inside me. Not in the way of breaking, but of releasing. I felt tears welling unexpected and unwelcome, but Helen just passed me a tissue from her pocket and continued talking about which tomato varieties grew best in the local soil, giving me time to compose myself. Before leaving, she invited me to join a small book group that met at her house monthly. "Nothing fancy, just neighbors discussing books over too much wine and cheese. Next Wednesday at 7 if you're interested." I promised to consider it, expecting to decline when the day came. Social gatherings had become foreign territory, filled with potential landmines of personal questions and the exhaustion of careful self-editing. But when Wednesday arrived, I found myself selecting a blouse I hadn't worn since moving, applying mascara and lipstick for the first time in months, and telling Popcorn I'd return in a few hours. Helen's home was everything mine aspired to be, comfortable, lived in, filled with evidence of a life fully inhabited. Bookshelves lined the walls, plants thrived in sunny corners, photographs documented decades of experiences. 4 other women were already gathered in the living room when I arrived, each welcoming me with uncomplicated friendliness. The discussion centered on a historical novel set during the Civil War, but conversation flowed naturally to other topics. Local politics, gardening challenges, a new restaurant in the next town over. No one pressed for my background or asked probing questions. I was simply accepted as Helen's neighbor, a newcomer who liked to read. As the evening progressed, I found myself speaking more, offering opinions about the book's historical accuracy, laughing at Ruth's dry observations about the author's romantic subplots. For a few hours, I was just a woman among women, not a victim, not a refugee from my own life, not a cautionary tale. Walking home under a sky scattered with stars, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with the 2 glasses of wine. Connections, tentative but real, were forming in this place I'd chosen as sanctuary. Roots beginning to reach into new soil. The book group became a monthly constant, then Helen's garden advice sessions, then occasional dinners with the Johnsons, who lived on the other side of the village. David, a retired high school principal, Martha, a former nurse who now volunteered at the local clinic. None of them pried into my past, but all created space for me to reveal pieces of myself at my own pace. Summer melted into fall. The apple trees in my yard produced a modest harvest. Small tart fruit perfect for the pies I learned to make from Helen's recipe. The leaves turned gold and crimson, then fell in rustling drifts that Popcorn delighted in charging through during our morning walks. I stacked firewood along the side of the house, cleaned the chimney with David's help, prepared for my first winter in a home heated primarily by the stone fireplace. It was the 3rd Saturday in October when Robert found me. The morning had been ordinary. Breakfast on the porch, despite the chill planning which windows needed weather stripping before November. Popcorn and I were returning from our walk when I saw the unfamiliar car parked in my driveway, its sleek black surface out of place against the rustic setting. My steps faltered as recognition dawned. Robert's BMW, the status symbol he'd purchased after his last promotion. Popcorn sensed my tension immediately, positioning himself between me and the vehicle, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Robert emerged from the car, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief as he surveyed my modest home. "So this is where you've been hiding." His voice carried across the yard that familiar tone of contempt slicing through the peaceful morning. A rundown farm in the middle of nowhere. Jesus, Mom, was the drama really necessary? I remained rooted at the edge of the property, Popcorn's leash tight in my grip. The sight of my son, still handsome in his tailored coat, still radiating that confidence that bordered on arrogance, sent contradictory emotions cascading through me. The instinctive love of a mother for her child, the bone-deep fear of the abused for their abuser. "How did you find me?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "It wasn't that difficult. The property records are public." He took a step toward me, and Popcorn's growl deepened, stopping Robert in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" "That's Popcorn. He doesn't like strangers." I moved forward carefully, maintaining distance, but refusing to cede my own property. "What do you want, Robert?" His face hardened, the veneer of civility thinning. "What do I want? Are you serious? You sold our house without warning, disappeared without a trace, and you're asking what I want. How about an explanation? How about the money from the sale that rightfully belongs to me? The house was purchased with the money from my apartment, the apartment James and I saved 30 years to buy." I kept my voice steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "You convinced me to put it in your name, but the original deeds were still mine." "That's not how it works. You signed transfer papers. The house was legally mine." Robert's voice rose, his hands gesturing emphatically. "I had to stay in a hotel for weeks. Carol's parents had to help us with the down payment on a new place. Do you have any idea what you put us through?" The irony struck me like a physical blow. His outrage over inconvenience, his silence about the violence that precipitated it. I felt something shift inside me, the last remnants of guilt or uncertainty burning away in the face of his entitled anger. "You hit me, Robert, 20 times. You called me a parasite in the house that my money bought. You humiliated me while your wife laughed." Each sentence emerged clear and uncompromising. "I don't owe you an explanation. I don't owe you money. I don't owe you anything at all." He flushed, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "That's not... You're exaggerating. It wasn't like that." "I have photographs of my face afterward, date-stamped, and witnesses who saw the bruises." For a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by defensive anger. "One incident after years of supporting you, and you blow it completely out of proportion. Typical. You always were too sensitive." Popcorn's growl intensified as Robert's voice rose. I placed a calming hand on his head while maintaining eye contact with my son. "You should leave now. Not without what's mine. Half the proceeds from the house sale at minimum. My lawyer says I have a case." I reached into my pocket, withdrew the folded papers I'd been carrying since Charlie warned me Robert might eventually track me down. "My lawyer says otherwise. These are copies of the original property deeds, the documentation of fraud in the transfer, and photographs of my injuries. Take them to your lawyer. If you want to pursue this in court, every detail will become public record." Robert took the papers automatically, his expression shifting between disbelief and growing realization. "You're blackmailing me. Your own son." "I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." I stood straighter, the fear that had initially gripped me giving way to a steady resolve. "I built a new life here, Robert. One where I'm not anyone's burden or punching bag. I won't let you destroy that." He leafed through the documents, his face paling as he saw the photographs. Clinical images of my bruised face from multiple angles, the calendar date clearly visible in each frame. Charlie had insisted on the documentation foreseeing exactly this confrontation. "This isn't over." Robert folded the papers, roughly shoved them into his coat pocket. "You can't just cut me out of your life. You cut yourself out when you raised your hand to me. You have no power over me anymore." The truth of the statement settled into my bones as I spoke it. "Goodbye, Robert." He stood for a long moment, conflict evident in his face. The man who believed himself entitled to my submission battling with the boy who'd once loved his mother. Finally, without another word, he turned and got back into his car. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as he reversed and drove away. I stood watching until the car disappeared around the bend, Popcorn pressing against my leg in silent support. Only when silence returned to the property did I allow my legs to give way, sinking onto the damp grass, hands trembling with delayed reaction. Popcorn nuzzled my face, uncharacteristically demonstrative in response to my distress. I buried my fingers in his warm fur, anchoring myself in the present rather than the swirling emotions the confrontation had unleashed. "We're okay," I whispered to myself. "We're still okay." Later that evening, Helen appeared at my door with a casserole and perceptive eyes. "Saw a fancy car speeding down the road earlier. Thought you might need dinner." I invited her in the events of the morning spilling out as we sat at my small kitchen table. Helen listened without interruption, her steady presence a ballast as I navigated the choppy waters of the confrontation's aftermath. "He'll be back," she said, finally practical as always. "I know. And you'll be ready when he is." It wasn't a question, but a statement of faith in my strength, one that warmed me more than the casserole. "I will." I realized I believed it. The woman who had endured that final dinner, those 20 slaps, was gone. In her place stood someone who had built a life from scratch, who had earned the friendship of good people and the trust of a wounded dog who had learned that boundaries weren't selfish, but necessary. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." Helen nodded, satisfied. Then, with typical directness, "Rebecca at the Women's Center mentioned they need volunteers for their crisis line. Thought of you immediately. You've got the right kind of experience." The suggestion caught me off guard. "I'm not a counselor. I don't have training." "They'll provide training. What they need are women who understand who've walked through the fire and come out the other side." Helen held my gaze steadily. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone in crisis is proof that survival is possible." The idea settled into my mind, taking root alongside the unexpected realization that my experience, painful as it was, might have value beyond my own healing. That the scars I carried could be maps for others, still searching for their way out. "I'll think about it," I promised. True to my word, I visited the center the following week. It occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house in the village, its entrance unmarked, except for a small plaque reading, "New Beginnings Women's Resource Center." Rebecca, the director, was a compact woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no-nonsense manner, who listened to my story without surprise or judgment. "Unfortunately, your experience isn't unique," she said when I'd finished. "Especially among women your age. There's a generation that was taught to endure, to prioritize family peace above personal safety. We see the consequences every day." She explained the center's services: crisis intervention, temporary housing, legal advocacy support groups. Most of their clients were younger women with children, but increasingly they were seeing older women seeking help after decades in abusive situations. "They often have the hardest time starting over," Rebecca explained. "Their entire identity is wrapped up in being wives and mothers. They have few independent financial resources, limited job skills, and they're ashamed, deeply, profoundly ashamed that they allowed the abuse to continue for so long." The words resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity. Hadn't I felt that same shame, that sense that I had somehow failed by not recognizing sooner, not acting earlier, not being stronger? "I'd like to help," I said finally. "If you think I can." Rebecca's smile was warm. "I know you can. The training starts next Tuesday. 6 weeks, 3 hours each session. It's thorough. Crisis intervention techniques, active listening skills, trauma-informed approaches. Not everyone completes it, and that's okay. It can bring up a lot." The warning proved accurate. Each training session excavated layers of my own experience, forcing me to examine beliefs and patterns I'd never fully articulated. Why had I stayed silent about Robert's escalating disrespect for so long? Why had I believed I deserved less than basic dignity? How had I confused sacrifice with self-erasure? The other trainees, 8 women ranging from college age to late 70s, became unexpected companions in this exploration. We shared stories during breaks, offered tissues during difficult modules, celebrated small breakthroughs in understanding. Among them, I found a particular kinship with Martha, a former accountant, whose adult daughter had cut contact after Martha finally left her abusive husband of 40 years. "She thinks I destroyed our family," Martha confided during our coffee break in the 4th week. "Says if I'd been more patient, more understanding of her father's stress, things would have worked out. She doesn't remember or doesn't want to remember what it was really like." I thought of Robert, his selective memory of our life together, his entitlement to my continued submission regardless of his behavior. "Children see what they can bear to see," I offered. "Sometimes the truth is too costly to their image of family, of themselves." Martha nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I keep telling myself I did the right thing even if I lose her forever, that my life has value separate from being her mother." "It does?" I reached across the table, squeezed her hand. "And so does mine." The simple affirmation, so obvious yet so revolutionary, resonated through me like a bell. My life had value. inherent unconditional value that wasn't determined by my usefulness to others or my capacity for silent endurance. The realization didn't strike like lightning, but settled like the gradual warming of earth in spring, a quiet awakening after a long dormancy. As winter deepened, my farmhouse became a haven against the cold. I installed storm windows, added insulation to the attic, kept the fireplace burning during the day. Popcorn claimed the rug before the hearth as his domain, stretching his length before the flames with luxurious contentment. The training at the center concluded with a small ceremony, each new volunteer receiving a certificate and officially joining the roster. I signed up for 2 4-hour shifts each week on the crisis line, nervous but determined to honor the commitment. My first call came barely an hour into my initial shift. A young woman voice, trembling, described her boyfriend's escalating control, monitoring her phone, isolating her from friends, punishing her for imagined flirtations. "But he says he loves me," she whispered. "Says no one will ever love me like he does." "Love doesn't hurt you," I responded gently, the words rising from a place of hard-won clarity. "Love doesn't diminish you. Real love helps you become more fully yourself, not less." The silence on the line stretched, broken finally by a soft intake of breath. I never thought about it that way before. By the end of the call, she had agreed to meet with an advocate at the center to discuss safety planning. I sat for a long moment after hanging up, aware that something significant had transpired. Not just for the caller, but for me. In articulating truth for someone else, I had solidified it within myself. As my shifts continued, I discovered an unexpected aptitude for the work. My age, which I had feared might be a barrier to connection with younger callers, often proved an asset. I brought perspective, patience, and a hard-earned wisdom that resonated across generational lines. Rebecca began assigning me the more complex cases, trusting my steady approach and growing expertise. When she asked if I would consider facilitating a support group for women over 50, I hesitated briefly before agreeing. The group, 5 women initially, then 8 as word spread, met weekly in the center's small conference room. Among them was Elelenina, an elegant woman in her early 60s who had fled her wealthy husband with nothing but the clothes she wore and a single suitcase. 41 years I was with him, she told the group during our 3rd session. Raised his children, managed his household, supported his career. Then I found evidence he was abusing our granddaughter during visits. When I confronted him, he broke my arm and threatened to have me committed if I told anyone. Said no one would believe a hysterical old woman over him. The room fell silent, the collective horror palpable. Elelenina continued her dignified bearing, undiminished by the terrible story. I left that night, waited until he was asleep, packed one bag, took my emergency cash, and walked out. I'm living in a studio apartment now, working part-time at a bookstore. At 63, I'm starting completely over. "And yet you're here," I said softly. "You're free." Elelenina's smile transformed her face, years falling away as genuine joy broke through. "Yes, despite everything, that's the miracle. I am finally truly free." The exchange crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate since beginning this work. Freedom wasn't the absence of hardship or the erasure of painful history. It wasn't even necessarily about physical safety or financial security, though these were crucial foundations. Freedom at its essence was the ability to author your own life, to make choices based on your own values rather than someone else's demands. To exist as a subject rather than an object in the story of your days. As winter reluctantly yielded to spring, I found myself drawn to document these insights. Late at night after my shifts at the center or following particularly powerful group sessions, I would sit at the small desk in my bedroom and write. Not with publication in mind, but as a way to distill and preserve the wisdom emerging from collective experience. The notebook filled gradually. Observations about the nature of abuse, reflections on recovery, practical advice for rebuilding. I wrote about the subtle erosion of self that precedes physical violence, the confusion of love with control, the particular challenges faced by older women seeking independence late in life. I wrote about shame and its antidotes, about boundaries as acts of self-respect rather than rejection, about the courage required to begin again when society expects you to simply endure. Helen discovered the manuscript during a visit, picking it up from my desk while I made tea. "This is remarkable," she said when I returned to the room. "You should publish it." I dismissed the suggestion immediately. "It's just notes, personal reflections." "It's much more than that. It's a roadmap for women who don't even know they're lost yet. Helen tapped the notebook emphatically. This could help people, Olivia. People who will never find their way to the center, who don't even have words for what they're experiencing. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and compelling, to share my story, our collective story, beyond the safe confines of the center. To speak openly about experiences often shrouded in shame and secrecy. To claim my voice not just in the privacy of my rebuilt life, but in the wider world. I wouldn't even know where to begin, I admitted. Helen's smile held a hint of mischief. As it happens, David's sister runs a small publishing house that specializes in women's issues. Let me make a call. Spring painted my little farm with new colors. Daffodils emerging along the driveway, fruit trees budding with shy promise, the stream running clear and swift with snowmelt. I'd survived my first winter in this place, learning the rhythms of rural life through freezing pipes and power outages, through the particular silence of snow-muffled mornings and the community's quiet ways of looking after one another. Helen's introduction to her sister-in-law, Patricia Winters of Crossroads Press, had initiated a process I'd never anticipated. My collection of writings, what I'd considered merely personal reflections, was being shaped into a manuscript with Patricia's gentle guidance. Starting over finding dignity and purpose after abuse would be a modest publication, she cautioned. Small print run, limited distribution, but her belief in its potential to help others overrode my lingering doubts about public exposure. You're not writing this for literary acclaim, Patricia reminded me during our weekly phone calls. You're writing it for the woman sitting alone in her kitchen at 2 a.m., wondering if this is all life has to offer her. You're writing it for the woman who doesn't even realize she deserves better. These conversations pushed me to dig deeper, to articulate truths I'd only begun to recognize. I wrote about the particular vulnerability of aging women in a society that renders them increasingly invisible, about financial dependency as a trap more binding than love, about the courage required to build a life from scratch when everyone expects you to simply accept diminishment as the natural condition of your final decades. The work absorbed me through muddy March into April's tentative warmth. Popcorn sprawled at my feet as I wrote, occasionally nudging my hand for attention, reminding me to pause to breathe, to engage with the present, rather than dwelling exclusively in reflection. His confidence had grown alongside mine. He now greeted Helen and the Johnsons with enthusiastic tail-wagging, though he remained wary of strangers, a guardian whose alertness I'd come to appreciate. I'd heard nothing from Robert since our confrontation in October. The silence wasn't peace. I still startled at unexpected car sounds, still rehearsed responses to imagined accusations, but it provided space for healing that continued in quiet, incremental ways. The bruises on my face had long since faded. The bruises on my spirit were slower to resolve, but no longer dominated my inner landscape. The manuscript was nearly complete when Rebecca approached me after a particularly powerful support group session. We're organizing a weekend retreat for survivors, she explained, women from centers across 3 counties. We'd like you to be one of the keynote speakers. The request sent immediate panic coursing through me. Writing my experiences for anonymous readers was one thing. Standing before a room of women making myself visible and vulnerable was entirely another. I'm not a public speaker, I protested. I've never done anything like that. Rebecca's expression remained gentle but firm. That's exactly why it needs to be you. Not a professional with polished phrases, but a woman who's lived this journey and can speak directly from that place. You connect with our clients in a way that's authentic and powerful. They need to hear from someone like them. I recognized the strategy. She was using my own commitment to helping others to override my fear, and knowing this didn't make it any less effective. How many people would be there? I asked finally. About 60 women, all survivors at different stages of recovery. Rebecca squeezed my arm lightly. Think about it. The retreat's still 6 weeks away. But Olivia, you have more to offer than you realize. The possibility lingered in my thoughts as I drove home, following the familiar curves of the country road that had become my path to belonging. 6 months ago, I could barely speak my truth to Helen across a kitchen table. Now I was being asked to share it with dozens of strangers. The very idea made my palms sweat against the steering wheel. Yet something in Rebecca's words had resonated beneath my fear. You have more to offer than you realize. How many times in my life had I diminished my own capabilities, silenced my own voice, made myself smaller to accommodate others' expectations? Even here in my new life, was I still limiting myself based on old patterns of thinking? That evening I called Martha, whose friendship had deepened through our shared volunteering at the center. "Could I practice with you?" I asked after explaining Rebecca's request. "If I decide to do this," Martha's enthusiasm buoyed my wavering resolution. We arranged weekly sessions at her apartment in the village where I would attempt to articulate my story in spoken form rather than written, with Martha providing feedback and encouragement. Our first session was halting my words tangling as self-consciousness overrode the clarity I'd found on paper. Martha listened patiently, then offered the insight that unlocked my paralysis. "You're trying to protect us from the ugly parts, the painful details. But that's where the connection happens, in the unvarnished truth that other women recognize from their own lives." Her observation cut through my hesitation. I'd spent a lifetime cushioning others from uncomfortable realities, managing impressions, smoothing rough edges. Even now, in trying to help, I was instinctively filtering my experience through concern for my audience's comfort rather than truth's necessity. "Tell it raw," Martha urged. "Trust that we can handle it, because we've lived versions of it. Trust that the painful parts are exactly what someone needs to hear to recognize her own situation." The next time we met, I spoke without notes, without filtering, without the careful distance I'd maintained even in my writing. I described the slow erosion of my personhood in Robert and Carol's home. The small daily humiliations, the growing invisibility, the careful navigation around Robert's moods. I detailed the final explosion of violence, not just the physical blows, but the emotional devastation of being struck by the child I'd raised, the surreal horror of Carol's laughter, punctuating each slap. When I finished, Martha sat in silence for several moments, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Then she rose and embraced me, a fierce protective hug that conveyed more than words could express. "That," she whispered against my hair, "is what they need to hear. Every raw, terrible, powerful bit of it. Because in hearing your truth, they'll find permission to acknowledge their own." Over the following weeks, I refined my presentation, finding the balance between unfiltered honesty and constructive hope. Martha invited other volunteers to our practice sessions, creating a small, supportive audience that helped desensitize me to the vulnerability of public speaking. With each telling, the story became simultaneously more personal and more universal, the specifics of my experience illuminating broader patterns of abuse and resilience. As the retreat approached, my nerves resurfaced with increasing intensity. The manuscript for Starting Over had been finalized, the first printed copies expected within days of the event. A synchronicity that felt meaningful, but added pressure. I would not just be speaking my truth, but offering tangible guidance based on that experience, stepping fully into a role I'd never imagined for myself. The morning of the retreat dawned clear and mild, perfect early May weather for the Lakeside Conference Center where the event would be held. Helen insisted on driving me, providing moral support during the hour-long journey and a reassuring presence as women began arriving. Some in groups, others alone, all carrying the invisible weight of experiences that had brought them to this gathering. Rebecca greeted me with a quick hug before leading me to the small cabin I'd been assigned for the weekend. "You're scheduled to speak after lunch tomorrow," she explained. "Today, just participate, get comfortable with the space and the women. Many of them have heard about you from their advocates. You're already making an impact just by being here." The notion that my presence alone could matter to these strangers was disorienting. I'd spent decades making myself unobtrusive, cultivating invisibility as a defense mechanism. To be seen, not just physically but recognized as a source of wisdom and inspiration, required a fundamental reorientation of my self-understanding. Throughout that first day, I participated in workshops on financial independence, boundary setting, and reconnecting with joy after trauma. I shared meals with women whose stories echoed aspects of my own. The gradual isolation, the financial control, the psychological manipulation that typically preceded physical violence. I listened more than I spoke, absorbing their courage, their struggles, their determination to reclaim lives that had been systematically dismantled. That evening, after the formal programming concluded, a small group gathered around the fire pit behind the main lodge. Someone produced a guitar, and singing gave way to storytelling laughter, intermixing with tears as women shared moments of both despair and triumph. The solidarity was palpable, a tapestry of shared experience woven from individual threads of pain and resilience. I sat slightly apart, watching the interplay of firelight on faces that had grown animated and open in this safe space. A young woman, barely 25 with a healing cut above her eye, approached hesitantly and sat beside me on the wooden bench. "My advocate told me about you." Her voice was soft, uncertain. Said you were 60 when you finally left, that you sold the house right out from under him. I nodded, waiting for her question or judgment. Instead, she surprised me with raw vulnerability. I keep thinking it's too late for me, that I've already wasted too many years, that I'll never get back what he took from me. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. 5 years doesn't seem like much compared to your story, but it feels like my whole life. The naked fear in her eyes, not of physical danger, but of a future forever defined by loss, struck a chord of recognition deep within me. How often had I thought the same in those early days after leaving, that the time lost was irrecoverable, that I'd forfeited too much to ever build something meaningful. The years weren't wasted, I told her gently. They were survived. There's a difference. And whatever time you have left, whether it's 5 years or 50, belongs to you now. That's the miracle we sometimes miss while focusing on what was taken. She absorbed this in silence, firelight reflecting in the tears that gathered but didn't fall. Does it ever stop hurting? Do you ever stop being angry? The question deserved honesty rather than easy comfort. The hurt changes shape. It becomes less about the specific wounds they inflicted and more about mourning the universal injustice, that anyone must endure such treatment, that our society still enables it. The anger? It transforms, too, into fuel for change, into compassion for others, still trapped into appreciation for your own strength. We talked until the fire burned low, this young woman with her fresh wounds and I with my scarred over ones spanning generations, but connected by shared understanding. When she finally rose to return to her cabin, she embraced me briefly. I'm going to remember this conversation when things get hard, she promised, that someone who made it through is rooting for me. I slept poorly that night, my thoughts circling around the responsibility of speaking to all these women the following day. What presumption! To think my individual experience could offer guidance to others with their own complex histories. What arrogance! To position myself as someone with wisdom to share when my own healing remained incomplete, my own future still unfolding with each uncertain step. Dawn found me sitting on the small porch of my cabin, watching mist rise from the lake as the first birdsong broke the silence. The beauty of the moment, transient perfect in its simplicity, gradually calmed the churning anxiety. I wasn't being asked to present myself as a finished product or an expert. I was simply offering my story as one possibility, one path through darkness, that others might adapt to their own journeys. After breakfast, I retreated to prepare for my talk, reviewing the notes I'd likely not use, but which provided a safety net for my nerves. A knock at the cabin door revealed Helen bearing a small wrapped package. Thought you might want this today. She placed it in my hands with characteristic directness. For courage. Inside was a brooch, silver filigree surrounding a polished river stone in shades of blue and gray. Simple but striking, clearly handcrafted with care. It belonged to my grandmother, Helen explained. She left an abusive husband in 1937 with 3 small children and only the clothes on her back. Worked as a seamstress, raised those kids alone, never remarried. Bought this for herself on the 10th anniversary of her escape. Said it reminded her that pressure creates beauty if you're strong enough to endure. The unexpected gift and its history momentarily robbed me of speech. I pinned it carefully to my blouse, the weight of both its physical presence and symbolic significance centering me. Thank you, I managed finally. For everything. Helen waved away my gratitude with characteristic briskness. Save your eloquence for your speech. You're going to be magnificent. The main meeting room was filled to capacity when I entered just before my scheduled time. Rebecca introduced me with a warmth that only increased my awareness of the expectations I was about to confront. 60 pairs of eyes tracked my progress to the small podium expressions ranging from curiosity to encouragement to the blank protective mask I recognized from my own experience. The carefully neutral face of someone unsure if it's safe to reveal themselves. My prepared notes suddenly seemed inadequate, a barrier between these women and the authentic connection they deserved. I set them aside, touched the brooch at my collar for reassurance, and began speaking directly from the center of my experience. At 60 years old, I thought I knew who I was. A mother, a widow, a woman who had built her life around caring for others. Then my son hit me 20 times at the dinner table, while my daughter-in-law laughed, and everything I thought I knew about myself, about family, about love, shattered in an instant. The room-stilled collective breath held as I continued into the raw heart of the story. The years of escalating disrespect, the financial manipulation, the final explosion of violence that catalyzed my escape. I described the fear and exhilaration of that first night, alone in the hotel room, the gradual rebuilding of identity separate from caretaking roles, the friendship with popcorn that had helped me relearn trust. We talk about starting over as if it's a clean break, a blank slate, I reflected. But that's not how healing works. We bring our scars with us. We bring our history, our hard-earned wisdom, our heightened awareness of both danger and possibility. Starting over doesn't mean erasing what came before. It means building something new on the foundation of who you've become through surviving. As I spoke, I watched understanding ripple through the audience. Nods of recognition, tissues quietly passed hands reaching to clasp their neighbors in silent solidarity. The connection was palpable, an exchange of energy that flowed between us, strengthening my voice even as emotion threatened to overwhelm it. There will be days when the weight of beginning again feels impossible, I acknowledged. Days when the injustice of having to rebuild what someone else destroyed will fill you with rage or despair. Those feelings are valid. They're part of the process, but they don't have to define your future. I touched on practical aspects, financial independence, legal protections, support systems, but emphasized the internal journey that underpinned external security. The most important boundary you'll ever establish isn't a restraining order or a locked door. It's the internal commitment to your own dignity, the non-negotiable certainty that you deserve respect. Everything else flows from that foundation. When I concluded after nearly 40 minutes, the silence hung for several heartbeats before the applause began. Not the polite acknowledgement I'd expected, but something more visceral and affirming. Women rose to their feet, applauding with tears streaming down many faces, including my own. It wasn't adulation they were expressing, but recognition of shared experience, of hard-won truth, of the possibility their own stories might someday transform from sources of shame to wellsprings of strength. The remainder of the retreat passed in a blur of conversations, hugs from strangers who no longer felt like strangers, exchanges of contact information with promises to stay connected. By Sunday afternoon, as participants gradually departed for their varied lives across the region, I felt simultaneously drained and energized, emptied of the emotional reserves required for such deep sharing, but replenished by the collective resilience I'd witnessed. Helen drove us home in companionable silence, respecting my need to process the intensity of the weekend. As we pulled into my driveway, Popcorn's excited barking greeting us from inside the house, she turned to me with uncharacteristic solemnity. "You've changed since that first day you showed up with bruises fading on your face," she observed. "Found your voice, your purpose." The simple assessment moved me deeply. "I never expected any of this," I admitted. "When I left, I was just trying to survive, to find some quiet corner where I could lick my wounds in peace." Helen laughed, the sound warm with affection. "The universe had bigger plans for you, apparently. And speaking of plans, Patricia called yesterday. Your books arrived. A whole box of them waiting at my place." The timing seemed fitting, the physical manifestation of my journey arriving just as I'd completed this latest step in sharing it with others. We detoured to Helen's farm, where the promised box sat on her front porch. Together, we cut through the packaging tape, revealing neatly stacked copies of Starting Over. The simple cover featuring a road winding toward mountains, my name printed across the bottom in straightforward type. Holding the finished book, tangible evidence of transformation of voice reclaimed, evoked emotions too complex for immediate articulation. I traced the embossed title with my fingertip, marveling at the distance traveled from that night of 20 slaps to this moment of creation. "Hard to believe this all started with an act of violence," I murmured half to myself. Helen shook her head firmly. "No, it started with an act of courage, the moment you decided your dignity mattered more than false peace. The violence was just the catalyst for what was already within you." Her reframing shifted something fundamental in my understanding of my own narrative. Not a victim who escaped, but a woman who reclaimed her inherent right to respect and self-determination. Not defined by what had happened to me, but by how I'd responded to it. The weeks following the retreat brought unexpected developments. Local media covered the event, including brief mentions of my speech and newly published book. A regional women's magazine requested an interview. Small bookstores in neighboring counties asked about hosting readings. The quiet life I'd envisioned for myself was expanding in ways both terrifying and exhilarating. Each new opportunity required a decision. How visible did I want to become? How much energy could I dedicate to this emerging role as advocate and voice for women like myself? Where was the balance between privacy and the responsibility I felt toward those still struggling to find their way toward freedom? I navigated these questions with the support of my growing circle. Helen's pragmatism, Martha's empathy, the Johnsons' steadfast encouragement, Rebecca's professional guidance. Popcorn remained my constant companion, his unwavering acceptance, a daily reminder of how far we'd both come in learning to trust again. It was Martha who suggested hosting a gathering at my farm to celebrate the book's publication. Not a formal launch, just friends and people who've supported your journey. The idea appealed to me, marking this milestone not in a public venue, but in the home I'd created for myself, the sanctuary that had enabled my healing and growth. The day arrived with perfect early summer weather. Clear skies, gentle breeze, wildflowers dotting the meadow beyond my yard. I'd spent the morning preparing simple food: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green bean casserole, cornbread. Popcorn lounged near the kitchen, occasionally opening an eye to check on my progress before returning to his contented dozing. I surveyed my small kingdom with quiet satisfaction. The house gleamed with fresh paint and care, surrounded by gardens now coming into their second-year fullness. My watercolor paintings, a hobby discovered during those first lonely months, hung on walls once bare. Every corner reflected choices made with intention, rather than compromise or fear. Guests began arriving around noon, Helen first bearing a lemon cake, the Johnsons with special apple cider, Martha accompanied by 2 women from the center, Elena appearing with a childhood friend she'd reconnected with since leaving her husband. We set up a large table on the porch, spreading a colorful tablecloth I'd embroidered during winter evenings. Laughter and conversation flowed as freely as the cider, these people who had become essential to my new life, sharing stories and observations, without the careful self-censorship I'd grown accustomed to in my former home. I observed the diverse gathering with profound gratitude, the unlikely tapestry of connections that had formed in just 18 months the community that had emerged from what initially seemed like exile. After lunch, as we lingered over coffee and Helen's cake, a car approached on the gravel drive, an unfamiliar sedan moving slowly, tentatively. Conversation at the table faltered as heads turned toward the unexpected arrival. "Are you expecting anyone else, Olivia?" Helen asked, already half rising, protectively alert. "No," I replied, standing to get a better view. My heart accelerated as the car parked the familiar surge of anxiety whenever an unknown vehicle approached my property. Experience had taught me to be cautious, especially given the increased visibility the book and recent media coverage had created. The driver's door opened and Robert emerged, looking hesitant in a way I'd rarely seen him. He carried a small package, his posture lacking the aggressive confidence that had characterized our last encounter 8 months earlier. "Sorry for showing up unannounced," he called from beside his car, keeping his distance. "I called many times, but no one answered." "We were having lunch?" I gestured toward the table of friends who were watching with undisguised concern. "It's the celebration of my 2nd anniversary here." Robert glanced at the gathered group, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected audience. "I didn't know you had visitors. I can come back another day." I hesitated, torn between the instinctive desire to avoid conflict and the recognition that unresolved business with my son still cast a shadow over my new life. This unexpected appearance offered an opportunity to close a chapter that otherwise might remain perpetually open-ended. "What do you want, Robert?" The directness of my question surprised us both. He held out the small package he'd been carrying. "I brought you this. Next week is your 62nd birthday. I didn't want it to go unnoticed." The fact that he remembered the date caught me off guard. I accepted the package with a quiet thank you, maintaining emotional distance despite the automatic surge of maternal feeling his presence evoked. An awkward silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken history. Robert's eyes moved from me to the house, the property taking in the evidence of the life I'd built without him. "Your farm is beautiful," he finally commented, "just as you described it in the book." "It's my home now," I replied simply. He nodded, a flicker of something like regret crossing his features. "It looks like you're happy." "I am happy." I confirmed the simple truth of it, resonating through me with quiet power. "Robert, I have guests," I added softly but firmly, redirecting the conversation to its purpose. "Why don't you tell me what really brought you here?" He took a deep breath, finally meeting my eyes directly. "I'm moving to Charleston, South Carolina. Got a job there. I'm leaving next week." The information was delivered with an undertone of significance, as if this geographical shift represented something beyond mere relocation. "That's good for you," I responded, genuinely meaning it. "I think so," he agreed. "It's a new beginning, away from the memories, away from the people who knew the old me." His voice dropped slightly. "I needed to see you before I left, to tell you in person that I still regret it, that your book changed my life as much as yours, that now I understand what I did even though it took me too long." The words seemed sincere, free of the defensive anger that had characterized our last meeting. I studied my son's face, the lines etched by time and choices, the features that still echoed the boy he'd been, the man he might yet become. "I hope you find what you're looking for there," I said honestly, without bitterness or false warmth. Robert looked toward the porch where my friends waited their protective presence, a testimony to the community I'd created. "You built a beautiful life here. New people, a new purpose." He smiled sadly, resignation and acceptance mingled in his expression. "I'm glad for you, truly." In that moment, I felt a shift within me. Not forgiveness in the traditional sense, but release from the power our history had held over my peace. Robert no longer dominated my emotional landscape, neither as the beloved child of memory nor the abuser of recent years. He was simply a person on his own journey, our paths intersecting briefly before continuing in their separate directions. "Thank you for coming to say goodbye," I acknowledged. "And good luck in Charleston." He nodded, understanding that this was the resolution we both needed. No dramatic reconciliation, no promises of renewed relationship, just mutual recognition and respect for the boundaries that defined our new reality. "Goodbye, Olivia," he said, using my name rather than Mom, a subtle but significant acknowledgement of my identity beyond maternal roles. "Goodbye, Robert." He returned to his car and drove away while I remained standing in the yard, the small gift still in my hand. I watched until the vehicle disappeared around the bend in the road, feeling neither triumph nor grief, but a quiet completeness, as if a story had reached its natural conclusion. When I rejoined my friends on the porch, their concerned faces greeted me. "Are you okay?" Helen asked immediately. "Yes." I settled back into my chair, placing the package on the table. "He came to say goodbye. He's moving south." "And that's the end?" Elena asked softly, understanding the complexity of severing family ties better than most. "I think it's a fitting end. Not dramatic, not cinematic, simply sufficient." Around the table came murmurs of understanding from women who recognized the value of clean conclusions, of chapters properly closed. "What did he bring you?" Helen gestured toward the still-wrapped package. "I don't know." I began carefully unwrapping it, revealing a carved wooden box. Inside lay my grandmother's gold wristwatch. First hers, then my mother's, finally mine. A family heirloom I'd thought lost in the hasty departure from my former home. A small note accompanied it. "I found this among the things that were left. I know how much it means to you. I'm sorry for everything." I gently touched the watch, feeling its connection to my female lineage, to the history that had shaped me. "It's my grandmother's," I explained to my friends. The simple return of this meaningful object, neither grand gesture nor empty symbolism, seemed appropriate to the moment. "How wonderful that it has returned to you," Martha commented softly. I slipped the watch onto my wrist, completing a circle of connection that spanned generations. The afternoon continued in lighter spirits, Robert's unexpected visit adding a note of closure rather than disruption to the celebration. After the last guest departed, I sat alone on the porch with popcorn, watching the sun begin its descent. My grandmother's watch caught the fading light, the gold surface gleaming softly as it marked time. Not just hours and minutes, but the larger passages of a life reclaimed and redirected. Reflecting on the 2 years that had passed since those 20 slaps at the dinner table, I marveled at the distance traveled. Not just the physical miles between my former prison and current haven, but the emotional and spiritual journey from victim to advocate, from silent endurance to powerful voice. The woman who had trembled under her son's blows had transformed into someone I barely recognized, yet increasingly embraced. Stronger, clearer, more authentically herself than at any previous point in her 6 decades. At 62, I had rebuilt not merely a life, but an identity founded on conscious choices and healthy boundaries, rather than sacrifice and obligation. Perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that it is never too late to say no to disrespect, no to violence, no to relationships that diminish rather than enhance, And simultaneously, it is never too late to say yes to yourself, to your dignity, your dreams, your right to determine the shape of your remaining days. The sun disappeared completely behind the distant hills. I rose, called to popcorn, and went inside to the house I had truly made my own. Tomorrow would be another day in my new life, a life conquered not just by surviving those slaps, but by finding the courage to respond to them, not with more violence, but with a cold, precise determination that had changed everything. As I prepared for sleep, I thought about those words, starting over. The title of my book, the theme of the support group, the essence of a life reclaimed. Starting over doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending the wounds never existed. It means building something new and better on the foundation of those scars, using them as strengthening elements rather than limitations. Robert was starting over in Charleston. Elena was starting over on the coast. Other women were starting over in shelters, in city apartments, in new relationships. And I had started over here among the apple and peach trees with a caramel-colored dog and a murmuring stream surrounded by people who saw me for who I am rather than what they could extract from me. Time had taught me that revenge doesn't need to be loud or violent to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to be diminished by it, building a life so full and meaningful that those who sought to destroy you become irrelevant, not through hatred, but through growth beyond their capacity to harm. This was my truth at 62, that life can bloom most gloriously after devastation, that the strongest roots often grow in soil that has been completely turned over, that it is never ever too late to say this life is mine.